My daughter treated me as if I were dead for 22 Christmases, until I bought my dream mansion. She returned with her husband, a locksmith, and a stack of forged documents. Her husband smirked and said, "You're going to leave this place empty-handed." I just smiled and opened the door. They thought they were walking into their new home. Little did they know they were stepping right into a trap I had been preparing for months. I'm incredibly grateful to have you here today. To help us connect, please comment below with the city or country you are watching from. Also, please note, this narrative incorporates dramatized elements for educational and entertainment value. Any resemblance to actual names or places is coincidental, but the core lesson remains deeply valuable for your life. The first thing I ever built for my daughter was a chair she could stand on. That tells you something about who I was back then. Not a man who bought things, a man who made them. I had a wood shop in the back of a rented house in Clarksville, Tennessee. Nothing fancy, just a workbench, a set of chisels, and a table saw I'd bought secondhand from a man who was moving to Florida and needed the cash before Tuesday. I spent most of my evenings out there after my shift at the lumber yard shaping pieces of wood into things that felt solid and true. It was the only kind of prayer I knew how to say. My wife Carol used to stand in the doorway of the shop with her arms crossed and her head tilted watching me work. "You're going to sand your fingerprints off one of these days," she'd say. And I'd say, "Then nobody can prove I was ever here." She'd laugh that low laugh that started in her chest, and the sound of it filled the whole backyard. Carol died on a Thursday morning in April 38 years ago. She made it through the labor. Our daughter didn't wait. The doctors said there were complications, a phrase that has always struck me as one of the cruelest in the English language, because complications sounds like something you can work through, something you can fix with the right tools and enough time. There was no fixing it. Carol was gone before I had finished filling out the paperwork in the waiting room. I was 26 years old, and I walked out of that hospital holding a baby girl I had no idea how to raise, and the woman who was supposed to help me figure it out was lying in a room down the hall where I couldn't follow. I named the baby Megan. Carol had picked the name out back in November, written it on a piece of paper she tucked into her Bible. I found it 3 days after the funeral, and I held that slip of paper so long the ink smeared. It was the last handwriting she ever left me. I treated it like a deed. People in our church offered to help. Carol's mother volunteered to take the baby. My own mother drove up from Murfreesboro and stayed for 2 weeks feeding Megan through the night, while I sat in the wood shop and sanded things that didn't need sanding. Everyone meant well. Everyone was waiting for me to agree that I couldn't do this alone. I didn't agree. Stubbornness is not always a virtue, but sometimes it's the only thing standing between a man and giving up what he loves most. I kept Megan. I arranged my shifts so I was home by 4. I learned to braid hair by watching a VHS tape a neighbor lent me. I burned a lot of dinners before I figured out that the secret to a good pot of chili is patience, and that patience is something a grieving man has to practice the same way he practices anything else badly, at first and then better. Megan was 3 years old when she started following me into the woodshop. She'd stand at the edge of the workbench with her chin barely clearing the top, straining to see what my hands were doing. "Up," she'd say. Just that one word, arms raised, fists opening and closing. "Up, Daddy, up." I'd lift her, and she'd sit on the edge of the bench, watching me work, asking questions about every single tool. "What does that one do? Why does the wood smell like that? Can I touch it?" She never got tired of watching, and I never got tired of her watching. But she was growing, and the bench was fixed, and there were nights when the straining bothered me. Watching a child reach for something just out of reach bothers a father in a place he can't explain. So I built her the stool. It wasn't complicated. 12 inches tall, square seat, 4 legs with a slight outward angle so it wouldn't tip. I used the best oak I had in the shop, the piece I'd been saving for a project I never quite started. I sanded it down until it was smooth as soap and rubbed it with linseed oil until the grain came up golden in the shop light. On the underside of the seat, I burned 3 letters with a wood-burning tool I'd gotten for Christmas MCC. Megan Carol Callahan. Her full name. All 3 of hers. When I set it in front of the workbench and lifted her onto it, she gripped the edge of the bench with both hands and pulled herself up straight and looked at everything in front of her like a captain who had just climbed to the bridge of her ship for the first time. "I can see," she announced, like it was news, like visibility was something she'd been waiting her whole short life to report. "You can see," I agreed. She looked over at me with those serious gray eyes, Carol's eyes, and said, "Build me something, Daddy." So I did. I built her everything I could for as long as she let me. The stool went everywhere that family went. When we moved from Clarksville to a rented duplex in Nashville, I wrapped it in a moving blanket and set it in the cab of the truck with me instead of the back. When Megan started school and had no use for standing on a stool in a wood shop because she had her own desk and her own chair and her own world that was slowly becoming separate from mine, I moved it to the corner of the kitchen. It became the place where she did her homework, where she ate cereal on Saturday mornings, where she sat and told me about the hard parts of her day, while I washed dishes and listened without turning around, because sometimes a kid talks easier when no one is looking directly at her. I should have known something was shifting when she stopped sitting on it. 13, 14, 15. The stool moved into the corner and then further into the corner and finally against the wall where it collected dust and the occasional jacket thrown over the back. She had her own life by then. Friends I hadn't met, plans that didn't include me, a private self that was growing faster than I knew how to follow. I told myself that was normal. It was normal. Every father loses his daughter to her own life at some point, and if he's done his job right, he loses her to something good. I was still telling myself that the morning I walked into the kitchen and found the stool sitting in the middle of the floor, clean of dust, like someone had moved it deliberately. The hairs on the back of my neck rose before I understood why. Megan was already gone. The wooden box where I kept my savings was a piece I had made myself walnut, with a fitted lid and a small brass latch. I kept it on the top shelf of my bedroom closet, behind a stack of folded flannel shirts. Megan had known it was there since she was 9 years old. I had shown it to her myself. I opened it that morning because I heard the Corolla start up before dawn and then go quiet too fast, the engine cutting out at the end of the driveway instead of pulling away. I lay in bed for a moment, listening to that silence and feeling something cold move through my chest. Then I got up, went to the closet, and lifted the lid. The box was not empty. She had left $40 and a note folded twice. The note said, "I am sorry, Daddy. I have to go find out who I am without this house." The handwriting was careful, the way her handwriting always was when she was writing something she had rehearsed. There was no destination, no phone number, no promise to call. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding that piece of paper for a long time. Outside the window, the sky was just starting to lighten along the bottom, that gray-pink color that happens before the sun makes up its mind. I read the note 4 times. I read it 4 times because I kept hoping the 5th line would appear, the one that told me where she was going, the one that said she'd be back for the stool. There was no 5th line. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because men of my generation were not raised to be precise about feelings, and imprecision has cost me more than I can calculate. What I felt was not anger. What I felt was not even surprise, not entirely, because the drift had been happening for years, and some part of me had been watching it, the way you watch a crack in a wall, noting it, hoping it stops, not wanting to be the one who says it out loud. What I felt was a grief so specific, it had its own shape, the shape of a chair. A child no longer sits in the shape of a question that has been answered in a way you never prepared for. I walked to the kitchen. The stool was in the middle of the floor. She had moved it there deliberately. I understood that now. It was the only goodbye she left me that wasn't words. I sat down on it. A grown man, 51 inches of solid oak between me and the linoleum, my knees up near my chin, sitting on a child's stool in an empty kitchen at 5:30 in the morning. And I cried. I want to be clear about that too, because this story has harder moments coming, and I need you to understand that I am not a man who holds things in until they calcify. I cried hard, the kind of crying that makes no sound at first, and then makes too much, the kind that surprises you with how physical it is, how much your chest and your throat are involved. I cried for Carol, who should have been there. I cried for the version of this family we never got to be. And I cried for Megan, not because she left, but because she felt she had to. When it was done, I washed my face at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at the Corolla sitting at the end of the driveway. She had taken a bus, or a friend had picked her up. Either way, she was gone on someone else's transportation, which meant she had been planning this long enough to arrange it. That stung in a specific way, the way it stings when you realize a decision was made about you in rooms you weren't in. I dried my hands. I put the note back in the wooden box. I put the box back on the shelf behind the flannel shirts. Then I went out to the driveway, got in the Corolla, and drove to the hardware store before it opened, sitting in the parking lot until the lights came on inside. When the doors unlocked, I went in and bought a mop, a bucket, a box of heavy-duty trash bags, and 2 bottles of all-purpose cleaner. The yellow bucket was the cheapest one they had, $4.69. That afternoon, I drove to a neighborhood 3 miles away and knocked on the door of a woman I'd heard mention at church that she couldn't keep up with the house since her husband left. She looked at me standing on her porch with my yellow bucket and my box of supplies, and she said, "You're Robert Callahan. You build things." "I clean them too," I said. "First one's half price." She let me in. I cleaned that kitchen so thoroughly, she stood in the doorway afterward, with her hand over her mouth, not sure what to say. She paid me $40. I drove home, split the money between 3 mason jars I lined up on the kitchen counter, labeled with strips of masking tape. The first jar said gas. The second said supplies. The third jar I left blank for 2 days before I wrote anything on it. On the third day, I wrote the house. I found out Megan had gotten married through a woman named Patrice who sang in the choir at my church and whose cousin had been at the wedding. That is how I learned my daughter had a husband. Not from a phone call, not from an invitation. From a woman in a burgundy choir robe who touched my arm after the Sunday service and said quietly, like she was delivering news she wasn't sure I already had, "Robert, I heard about Megan. I think congratulations are in order." She looked at my face and understood immediately that they were not. I drove home and sat in the kitchen for a long time. The stool was against the wall by then, pushed aside by the ordinary accumulation of a life lived alone. I thought about pulling it out and sitting on it the way I had that first morning, but I didn't. Some gestures can only be made once before they become theater. What I felt was not betrayal exactly. Betrayal implies a contract, and Megan had made it clear when she left that she was not interested in contracts with me. What I felt was something quieter and more corrosive, the feeling of having been edited out. Like someone had gone back through the story of her life and removed my scenes, and the story still made sense without them. And that was the part that hurt most. For 2 years after that, I didn't try to find her. I told myself it was respect for her choice. Mostly, it was fear, the specific fear of a man who is not sure what he will do with himself if he knocks on a door and the person inside doesn't open it. Then Christmas came around again, and something in me that I had been successfully ignoring for 24 months refused to be ignored any longer. Patrice, God bless her, had a cousin who had a friend who had been to Megan's house for a birthday party. I am not proud of how many degrees of separation I was willing to work through. But I got the address, a neighborhood called Birchwood Estates, 40 minutes north, the kind of place where the lawns are professionally maintained and the mailboxes all match. I spent 3 weeks making her a gift. Not buying. Making. I turned a piece of cherry wood on the lathe until it became a small oval frame, sanded it through 6 grits until it was as smooth as riverstone, then carved a border of interlocking leaves around the edge, the way Carol used to press leaves into the clay ornaments she made every December. Inside the frame, I put a photograph, the only one I had, of the 3 of us, Carol and me and Megan, at 2 days old, Carol's eyes already going tired, but her smile absolutely refusing to acknowledge it. I also baked snickerdoodles because they had been Megan's favorite since she was 6, and had decided with the total authority of a 6-year-old that cinnamon was the greatest flavor in human history. I packed them in a tin I'd found at the dollar store, the kind with a winter scene on the lid, cardinals in snow. I drove up on Christmas Eve. I told myself it was the spirit of the season. Really it was that I couldn't think of another occasion, with a built-in excuse for showing up. The house was large. Not mansion large, but larger than anything I had ever owned. Brick front white trim, a wreath on the door, made of real pine that you could smell from the driveway. Every window was lit. I sat in the Corolla for 10 minutes in front of that house, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, telling myself to either go up to the door or go home. I went up to the door. I rang the bell. I heard voices inside, several of them, a gathering already in progress. Then footsteps. The door opened, and Megan stood there, in a green dress I had never seen her hair done, in a way I didn't recognize. And for 1/2 second, something crossed her face that I can only describe as the expression of a person who sees something they love and something they fear arriving in the same body at the same time. It was there, and then it was gone so fast I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. She stepped outside and pulled the door most of the way closed behind her. "Daddy." Her voice was low and careful, the voice she used when she was trying to manage a situation. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." I held out the tin and the frame. "I made you something." She took them without looking at them. Her eyes were moving past my shoulder to the driveway, to the street, checking something. Then she looked back at me, and her jaw was set in a way I recognized the way it set when she had made a decision she knew I wouldn't like, and had decided not to apologize for it. "You can't be here," she said. My hands, now empty, didn't know what to do with themselves. "It's Christmas. I know what day it is." She glanced back at the door. Inside, a man's laugh rose above the other voices, easy and loud, the laugh of someone completely at home. "Julian's family is here. His parents, his sister. I told them my parents were both gone." The sentence landed the way sentences land when they are designed to wound efficiently. Both gone. Past tense. Departed. I stood on my daughter's porch in the cold and understood that she had buried me alongside Carol, that somewhere in the construction of this new life she was building, I had been assigned to the category of things that no longer existed. "Megan," I said. My voice came out wrong, rough at the bottom in a way I hadn't expected. "Please." She pressed the tin and the frame back into my hands. Her fingers were cold. She wasn't wearing a coat, and she was shivering slightly, though I did not think it was entirely from the temperature. "I'll call you. After the holidays. I promise." She did not call after the holidays. I drove home in a snowstorm that had not been in the forecast. The wipers working hard against it, the tin of snickerdoodles, and the cherry wood frame on the passenger seat beside me. At some point on the highway, I started talking out loud, not to anyone, just talking, saying things into the cab of the Corolla that I had no other place to put. I said her name a few times. I said Carol's name once, which surprised me. I asked the windshield questions it couldn't answer. By the time I got home, the snow was coming down in earnest, covering the yard, covering the driveway, covering the roof of the woodshop, where the lathe that had made that frame was sitting cold and silent. I sat in the parked car in my own driveway for a long time, watching the snow cover everything, thinking about how it does that without asking, without explaining, without once considering whether the things underneath it wanted to be covered. I took the snickerdoodles inside. I ate them alone over the next 4 days, standing at the kitchen counter, and they tasted exactly the way they always had. That was the last time I tried to be part of her Christmas, and the last time for a very long while that I let myself hope the math had changed. The number I had for Megan stopped working in February. I know the exact month because I had been calling it on the first of every month since that Christmas Eve on her porch. One call, never more than one, always from home, so I'd know I made it. February the 1st, I dialed and got a recording that said the number was no longer in service, and I sat there with the phone against my ear, listening to that recording for longer than made any sense, as if the message might change if I gave it enough time. It did not change. I tried twice more that week, mornings before work, just to be sure. Same recording both times. She had changed the number without telling me, which meant she had thought about the possibility that I might call and decided deliberately and in advance that she did not want me to reach her. That is a specific kind of knowledge, the kind that doesn't soften with time. You can learn to carry it without letting it cripple you, but you don't forget the shape of it. I wrote her a letter that March. 3 paragraphs, careful and plain. I told her I wasn't asking for anything. I told her I just wanted to know she was all right. I addressed it to the house in Birchwood Estates, the brick front with the matching mailbox, and I mailed it with a return address and waited. 6 weeks later, the envelope came back to me unopened, stamped with the words, "Return to sender, addressee unknown." She had moved. She had moved and not left a forwarding address which, combined with the changed phone number, added up to something I had to stop pretending was anything other than what it was. My daughter had made me disappear, not in anger as far as I could tell. There were no accusations, no confrontations, no list of grievances delivered at volume. She had simply decided quietly and thoroughly that the version of her life she was building did not have a place in it for me. And she had gone about removing me from it with the same quiet thoroughness she'd brought to everything since she was a child. The same focus she used to bring to a math problem or a jigsaw puzzle, working steadily until the picture came together the way she wanted it. I spent 3 weeks after that letter came back doing something I am not proud of. I drove past the Birchwood Estates neighborhood twice, slowly, the way you drive past a place you used to live and don't quite believe you no longer have access to. The second time, a security guard at the entrance booth asked if I was looking for something, and I said no, and drove home, and did not go back. Some forms of looking for someone become something else if you keep at them long enough, and I was not willing to become that. So I stopped. Stopping was not the same as not caring. I want to be precise about that. Every December, when the hardware stores put up the Christmas displays and the radio stations switched over to the same rotation of carols they always play, something in my chest did a thing I can only describe as a flinching, the involuntary response of an old wound that never fully closed. I'd be in the paint aisle at the hardware store, reaching for a can of wood stain, and Bing Crosby would come on the overhead speaker, and for about 4 seconds, I'd be back on that porch in the cold, with an empty tin of snickerdoodles and her voice saying, "Please, 4 seconds." Then I'd pick up the wood stain and go to the register and go home and get on with it, because getting on with it was the thing I knew how to do better than almost anything else. The stool came with me every time I moved. That might seem like a small detail, but I have thought about it enough to know it wasn't. I moved 3 times in the 10 years after Megan left from the rented house in Clarksville to a small apartment in Nashville, then to a slightly larger apartment in Hendersonville. When the business started to grow, then to a townhouse I rented by the year once I had employees, and needed to project the kind of stability that reassures people. Every time I wrapped the stool in a moving blanket and carried it in the cab of the truck with me, instead of putting it in the back with everything else. Every time I put it against the kitchen wall in the new place, and every time it looked exactly like what it was, the one piece of furniture in my home that was not for me. The business grew the way honest work grows, which is to say, slowly, and then at some point you can't quite identify in retrospect all at once. I had gone from the yellow bucket and the Corolla to a second-hand cargo van by the 3rd year. By the 5th year, I had 2 vans and 3 people on payroll, real payroll with taxes withheld, and health coverage that wasn't much, but was something. By the 10th year, Booth Property Care had contracts with 4 different residential management companies and a reputation in the nicer neighborhoods of Nashville that I had built the same way I built everything, one careful job at a time, never cutting corners, because I had decided early on that corners were where trust lived, and trust was the only thing I was selling that couldn't be replaced if I lost it. People in those big houses gave me their keys without a second thought. That meant something to me that I never quite found the words for at the time, though I understand it better now. They gave me their keys because they knew I would treat their homes like something sacred. What they didn't know was why I felt that way. They had always had a home. For most of them, it was simply where they lived, the backdrop of their daily life. For me, a home was the thing I had spent my whole adult life working toward, the single concrete proof that a man's labor could accumulate into something that held something with a door and a lock, and his name attached to it, in a way that couldn't be undone by someone else's decision. By the time I turned 58, Booth Property Care had 4 vans, 11 employees, and a reputation that spread without me having to push it. I had become, without quite noticing, it happened the way you don't notice a tree growing when you see it every day, a man of some standing. Not wealthy by the measure of the people I worked for, but solid, stable, the kind of stable where you check the business account on a Monday morning and feel something in your shoulders relax. Megan had no idea. We had not spoken in almost 15 years. As far as she knew, I was still the man with the yellow bucket and the rented apartment, still working my way around other people's houses for $12 an hour. Still the father she had decided not to have. The thought crossed my mind sometimes late at night in the kitchen, with a glass of water and the stool against the wall, that if she could see what I had built, she might look at it differently. She might look at me differently. Then I would go to bed and remind myself that a man does not build his life to be looked at. He builds it to live in. And what I was building now, slowly and with great care, and with every lesson I had learned from every mistake I had made, was the last thing on the list. The thing I had written on the 3rd mason jar all those years ago. The house. I found the house on a Tuesday in September, the way you find most things that matter, not by looking for them exactly, but by being ready when they appeared. A property management client of mine had called about a listing in a neighborhood called Cedarwood Heights, a Victorian on the corner, that had been sitting on the market for 4 months because the previous owners had let it go in ways that frightened most buyers. The inspection report was 41 pages long. The realtor had described it with the particular optimism of someone working on commission as a property with exceptional bones and significant upside potential. What she meant was that the roof needed replacing, the plumbing was a generation behind, and someone had made decisions about the kitchen in the 1980s that the house had not recovered from. I drove over on my lunch break, parked on the street, and sat in the truck looking at it for a while before I got out. It was a 3-story Queen Anne with a wraparound porch and a corner turret that rose up past the second floor, its conical roof gone green with age. The clapboard siding had been painted white at some point and was now the color of old piano keys. 2 of the porch balusters were missing. The yard was overgrown in the specific way that happens when a house has been unloved rather than unoccupied. The difference being that unloved things tend to grow wild in irregular patches, which is exactly what the yard had done. I got out of the truck. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at it, the way I have always looked at things I am considering taking on, which is to say, straight at the worst of it first. The sagging porch corner, the oxidized gutters, the window on the 3rd floor with the crack running diagonally from the lower left to the upper right, like a question someone had asked the glass a long time ago. Then I looked at the rest of it. The foundation was solid, poured concrete rather than the fieldstone you sometimes find in houses this age, which meant the structural integrity was sound, regardless of what had happened to the surfaces. The porch columns, though needing paint, were original and intact old-growth wood that you cannot buy anymore, and that would outlast anything manufactured today. The turret room windows, even cracked, were the original wavy glass, the kind that makes the outside world look like it is slightly underwater. Beautiful in a way that modern flat glass never is. I walked around the perimeter. The roof had problems, but the rafters visible through the attic vent screens looked dry, no black staining, no sagging, which meant the water damage was recent and not yet structural. I had cleaned and managed 100 houses in 20 years. I knew what rot smelled like, and I knew what solid smelled like. This house smelled like solid underneath everything else. The realtor met me at the front door with a lockbox key and an expression that suggested she had shown this property enough times to have developed a practiced neutrality about the reactions of the people who walked through it. I walked through it without saying much. She had learned, apparently, that commentary was not what serious buyers wanted. I stood in the front hall for a long time. It was empty, the way houses are empty when they have been waiting a particular quality of silence that is different from the silence of a house that is simply unoccupied. The floors were heart pine original, buried under 3 generations of finish, but salvageable, deeply salvageable, the kind of wood that improves with the removing of what has been done to it, rather than the adding of anything new. The ceiling was 11 feet and intact. The staircase rose from the center of the hall in a gentle curve, the banister dark with age, but not damaged. I stood in that hall, and I saw it. Not what it was, what it could be. A long table by the front windows, the kind with room enough that you never have to count the chairs because there are always enough. A kitchen that worked the way a kitchen should, warm and functional and smelling of something on the stove. The turret room on the 3rd floor with a chair and good light, the kind of room you go to when you need to think without being interrupted by the rest of your life. I had been building toward this room my entire adult life. I just hadn't known which house it was in until I was standing inside it. I made an offer that afternoon, below asking, because the inspection report warranted it, and because 20 years in property management had taught me that sentimentality and negotiation do not belong in the same room. The sellers, an estate executor dealing with a property left by someone who had no local heirs, accepted within 48 hours. The closing was on a Friday morning in late September, a conference room in downtown Nashville with a long table covered in paper, which struck me as appropriate. Ruth Calloway, the real estate attorney I had worked with on commercial contracts for years, sat across from me and walked me through each document with the efficient calm of a woman who had done this several thousand times and found it no less important for the repetition. I signed my name so many times in 2 hours that my hand cramped on the 43rd signature, and I straightened my fingers and shook them out and signed again because each signature was a brick, and I was not going to stop laying them. At the end, Ruth slid the final document across the table and said, "This one's the deed. Read it before you sign." In real estate law, a deed is the document that legally establishes and transfers ownership of property. The grantee is the person receiving the property. It is the most fundamental piece of paper in the transaction, the one that says in plain legal language who the property belongs to and in what capacity. I read the line at the top 3 times. Grantee, Robert Allen Callahan, sole owner. Sole owner. 2 words. I had been a person that other people's lives were organized around, ignoring, and now there was a legal document recorded with the county, and carrying the weight of property law behind it, that named me as the only one. The only one. Ruth was watching me. She had known me long enough to know when something was landing. "You all right?" she asked. "I will be," I said, and I signed. That night, I drove to Cedarwood Heights alone and parked in the driveway of my house and sat on the porch steps in the dark with my hands wrapped around a cup of gas station coffee that had gone cold somewhere on the highway. The street was quiet. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something it had decided required its full professional attention. The porch boards creaked under me with the particular sound of old wood accepting weight it had been waiting to accept. I thought about the yellow bucket in the bed of my first cargo van. I thought about the mason jar with the masking tape label. I thought about Carol, who would have walked through every room of this house with her arms crossed and her head tilted, cataloging everything that needed doing and already mentally arranging the furniture she would have found at estate sales and refinished herself. I thought about the stool sitting against the kitchen wall of my townhouse 3 miles away, and whether it would look right in the kitchen of this house, and decided that it would look right wherever I put it, because it always had. I finished the cold coffee. I set the cup down on the porch beside me. Then I went inside and walked through every dark room of my house, touching the walls as I went. 3 weeks after closing, I was eating breakfast at the kitchen counter of my townhouse when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail, the way I let most unknown numbers go to voicemail, because 20 years of running a business had taught me that the calls worth taking almost always leave a message, and the ones that don't almost never are. I poured a second cup of coffee and waited. The voicemail notification came through 30 seconds later. I set down the cup and played it. A man's voice, professional and unhurried, identified himself as the editor of the Cedarwood Heights Neighborhood Association newsletter. He wanted to congratulate me on the acquisition of the property on Dunmore Street, and to let me know my company name had been included in the monthly property transfer notice, a public record summary the newsletter published each month as a service to residents. He hoped I would consider joining the Neighborhood Association. He hoped the renovation would go smoothly. He wished me a good morning. I deleted the message and finished my breakfast and did not think about it again until 4 days later when my phone rang and the screen showed a number I did not recognize but that had a Nashville area code and something in the back of my mind. Some old instinct honed by years of reading situations before they declared themselves made me answer it instead of letting it go. The silence on the line lasted exactly 2 seconds. I counted them. Then my daughter said, "Daddy." I have thought about that moment more than I can account for in words. Daddy. The word she had used from the time she could speak until the time she decided to stop. Hearing it again was like hearing a song you associated with a particular year of your life, the way it pulls the floor out from under you before you have time to brace. I sat down on the kitchen stool. The actual stool, the oak one still against the wall where it had lived in every kitchen I had occupied for 30 years. I sat down on it and gripped the edge of the seat with my free hand and said, "Megan," she cried. Not quietly. The kind of crying that has been waiting a long time to happen, that comes out uneven and uncontrolled. The kind you cannot perform because it is too ugly and too honest to be theater. She said she was sorry. She said it several times in between the ragged breaths, said it the way people say things they have been rehearsing alone for so long that the words have lost their individual weight and come out as one continuous sound. She said she had been wrong about the Christmas, about the phone number, about the letter, about all of it. She said she had been young and stupid and afraid, and that none of those things excused it, and she knew that. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, when the crying had settled into something quieter and more exhausted, I said, "Are you all right, Megan? Right now today. Are you all right?" She said yes. She said Julian was fine, that they had moved to a neighborhood in Hendersonville, that life was good. Her voice changed slightly when she said it, a shift so small that most people would not have caught it. I caught it because I had been listening to her voice or the memory of it for 22 years. I said I was glad she was well. I said it was good to hear her voice, which was true in the way that things can be true and complicated at the same time. We talked for 11 minutes. Careful, surface-level talk, the kind you have when you are two people standing on opposite banks of a river that is wider than either of you wants to say out loud. She mentioned the house, my house, lightly, the way you mention something you have been waiting to mention and have decided to approach from the side rather than directly. She said she had seen the newsletter notice and that it sounded like a beautiful property and that she would love to see it sometime. I said I would think about that. After we hung up, I sat on the stool for a long time and did not move. I thought about the 11 minutes and what had been in them and what had been missing from them. The missing was the thing that stayed with me. 22 years of silence does not get repaired in 11 minutes, and Megan had always been intelligent enough to know that which meant the 11 minutes were not an attempt at repair. They were something else. I just did not know yet what. 2 days later, a text message arrived from a number I had never seen. No greeting, no introduction. Just, "Hey, this is Julian, Megan's husband. Good to finally connect. Hey, listen, big old place like that one guy managing it alone. You must have a system for keeping track of important papers. Deed, title, insurance, all that. Where do you even store stuff like that? Fire safe safety deposit box." I read the message once. I set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment with my hands flat on the counter and my eyes on the window above the sink, where the backyard of the townhouse was doing its ordinary October things, leaves coming down from the oak tree in no particular hurry. Julian Crawford. I had met him exactly once at a distance through a window in Birchwood Estates 22 years ago. He had been a voice and a laugh and a reason my daughter sent me back to my truck with a tin of cookies and a carved picture frame. I knew his last name from Patrice, who had gotten it from her cousin, who had been at the wedding, and I had never had occasion to use it. Now here he was in my phone calling himself Megan's husband, as if I might have forgotten asking me where I kept my deed. There are questions people ask because they want information. There are questions people ask because they are testing a door to see if it is locked. I had been in property management long enough to know the difference between a tenant asking about building maintenance and a tenant measuring a room they were planning to change without permission. I picked up the phone. I did not answer Julian's text. Instead, I opened my contacts and scrolled to R and pressed the name I had been meaning to call since the conversation with Megan started feeling like something other than what it was pretending to be. Ruth Calloway answered on the second ring. "Robert," she said, in the tone of a woman who handles transactions and not surprises. "What do you need?" "A conversation," I said. "Today, if you have time. There's something I want to ask you about a deed." Ruth Calloway's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown Nashville, the kind of office that said its occupant had been at this long enough to stop needing to impress anyone with the furniture. The desk was oak old and unadorned. The bookshelves held actual books, not the decorative kind. The window behind her looked out over the Cumberland River, which was doing what it always did in October, running gray and purposeful, under a sky the color of wet concrete. She was reading Julian's text message when I came in. I had forwarded it to her from the parking garage before I got in the elevator, because Ruth was the kind of person who preferred to have read the material before the meeting, rather than during it. She set her phone down and looked at me across the desk, with an expression I had seen her use before, a particular stillness that meant she was about to tell me something I was not going to enjoy hearing, and had decided that the most respectful thing she could do was tell it to me straight. "How long have you owned the property?" she asked. 23 days, I said. She nodded slowly. "And your daughter has known about it for how long?" 3 weeks, roughly. Give or take a few days for the newsletter to circulate. Ruth picked up a pen not to write anything, just to hold. She did that when she was thinking. "Robert, I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer it the same way. Based on what you know about your daughter and her husband, do you believe this text message is what it is pretending to be? A friendly inquiry about home security from a concerned family member." I looked at her for a moment. "No," I said. "I don't." "Neither do I." She set the pen down. "So let me tell you about something called a quitclaim deed, and I want you to listen carefully, because this is the part where people usually wish they had paid attention sooner. A quitclaim deed," Ruth explained, "is one of the simplest property transfer documents in American real estate law. It is a single form, usually one page, that transfers whatever ownership interest one party holds in a property to another party. It requires a signature from the grantor, which is the person giving up the property, notarization of that signature and filing with the county recorder's office. The county recorder then logs it into the official property record, and it becomes part of the chain of title. The problem," Ruth said, leaning forward slightly for the part she wanted me to hear most clearly, "is that the county recorder's office does not verify the identity of the person who signed. They check that the notary stamp is present and that the form is filled out correctly. They do not call the grantor to confirm. They do not cross-reference the signature against existing records. They process what is handed to them across the counter, stamp it, and record it. Which means," I said, because I had been in property management long enough to see where this was going, "that someone could sign my name on one of those forms and file it. And it would be recorded," Ruth said, "officially, against your property. On paper, your house would appear to belong to whoever's name is in the grantee line." I sat with that for a moment. The Cumberland River moved behind Ruth's shoulder, gray and indifferent. "How often does this happen?" I asked. "More than you would believe," she said. "It is one of the fastest-growing property crimes in the country. And here is the part that most people find hardest to absorb." She paused. "In roughly 9 out of 10 cases, the person who files the fraudulent deed is not a stranger. It is someone the victim knows. Most of the time, it is family." The room was very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang twice and stopped. "There has to be a way to protect against it," I said. "There is," Ruth said, "and it is free, which is the part people are always surprised by." She turned to her computer and pulled up the Davidson County Register of Deeds website, rotating the monitor so I could see it. "This is called a property fraud alert. The county offers it at no charge. You register your name and your parcel number, and from the moment you enroll any document recorded against your property, triggers an automatic notification to you. An email, a text, depending on your preference. You become the first person to know instead of the last. It doesn't stop them from filing, I said. No, she agreed. The structural problem is at the recorder's window, and that is not something one registration fixes. But it means that the moment a fraudulent deed lands in that system, you know about it. And knowing is the difference between a crime that gets away and a crime that doesn't. She looked at me steadily. Do you want to set this up right now? I said yes. She walked me through it at her computer. The Davidson County Register of Deeds Fraud Alert Portal was straightforward, a form requesting name, contact information, and the parcel identification number from my deed. I entered everything while Ruth watched. The confirmation email arrived before we had finished talking, a simple message with a reference number and the words, "Your property is now being monitored." I asked her to print it. She printed it and also printed a certified copy of my recorded deed, the one with the county stamp in the corner and my name in the grantee line. She set both pages on the desk between us. 2 pieces of paper. One said the house was mine. The other promised I would be the first to know if anyone tried to say otherwise. Don't tell them you've done this, Ruth said. I wasn't planning to. And Robert. She tapped the edge of the desk once with her index finger, a small, precise gesture that meant she was saying the last thing, and it was the most important thing. Save everything. Every text, every voicemail, every call. If your instinct is right about what they're planning, the evidence they hand you before they act is going to be worth more than anything that comes after. I folded both pages and put them in the inside pocket of my jacket close to my chest. On the drive home, I stopped at the hardware store and bought a new file folder, the heavy-duty kind with the reinforced tabs. I labeled it with a strip of masking tape the same way I had labeled the mason jars 30 years ago, plain and factual. When I got home, I unlocked my front door and stood in the hall for a moment, looking at the ordinary contents of my ordinary life. Then I went to the kitchen, put the folder in the drawer beside the stove, and stood there with my hand on the counter and my eyes on the stool against the wall. 20 years in this business had taught me one thing above everything else. The people who lost their properties were almost never the ones who were unprepared from the beginning. They were the ones who felt the bad feeling early and then talked themselves out of it. I was not going to talk myself out of it. I made a pot of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table and started writing down everything I remembered about every conversation I had with Megan and Julian since the day she called. Dates, times, exact words, where I had them, paraphrases where I didn't. I wrote for an hour and a half without stopping. When I was done, I read it back and added 3 things I had initially left out because they had seemed too small to matter. Nothing was too small to matter. I had learned that the hard way, and I was not going to learn it again. She called 3 days before she came, which told me she had thought about it carefully enough to build in a buffer, enough time for me to say no if I was going to say no, enough time for her to prepare if I said yes. I said yes. I said it without deliberating out loud, because deliberating out loud would have told her something about my state of mind that I did not want her to have. Inside, I deliberated plenty. I stood in the kitchen after the call with my hand on the counter and went through it the way I go through every situation that has more than one layer to it, identifying what I knew, what I suspected, and what I could not yet prove, and deciding what a reasonable man with my information would do. A reasonable man would let her come. A reasonable man would watch and listen and give nothing away. She arrived on a Saturday morning in the second week of November, pulling into the driveway of my townhouse in a silver SUV that was newer than anything I had ever owned. I watched from the front window before I opened the door, not from hiding, but from the ordinary vantage point of a man standing in his own living room. She sat in the car for almost a full minute before she got out. I noticed that. A woman who had been rehearsing this visit in her head would sit in the car and run through it one more time before she committed to the driveway. When she came up the front walk, I opened the door before she could knock. She looked like Carol. That was the first thing I thought, the thing that hit me before I had time to arrange my reactions. The same way of carrying her shoulders slightly forward, like she was always just about to say something important. The same gray eyes, though the lines around them were new, the kind that come from years of decisions made in private. "Daddy," she said. Her voice was careful. "Megan." I stepped back from the door. "Come on in." She brought a bakery box, the kind tied with white string, from the kind of place that charges $4 for a muffin and is worth it. She set it on the kitchen counter and looked around the room the way people look at a place they are cataloging rather than simply seeing. Her eyes went to the stool against the wall and stayed there for 3 full seconds before she looked away. "You still have it," she said. "I move it with me," I said. "Always have." She didn't answer that. She opened the bakery box instead and took out 2 blueberry scones and put them on plates she found in my cabinet on the second try, which told me she had been in enough kitchens to know where people keep their plates without being told. I made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table and talked. It was the strangest 2 hours of my adult life. Not because anything dramatic happened, because nothing did. We talked the way 2 people talk when they are both working very hard to talk, normally covering the surface of things with the careful attention of people who know exactly how thin the ice is underneath them. She asked about the business. I told her the true parts, not all of them. She told me about her work, something in marketing, that she described in the way people describe jobs they are good at, but do not particularly love. I asked about her life and she answered the way she had always answered direct questions as a child, not with lies exactly, but with the version of the truth that required no follow-up. What I noticed was what she did not ask about. She did not ask about the house on Dunmore Street. She had mentioned it on the phone casually and with apparent eagerness, but she did not bring it up now. That told me the mention on the phone had been a test of my reaction, and that my non-committal answer had been the right one. We finished the scones. I poured second coffees. She was easy to be with in the way that people who have spent years managing social situations become easy to be with, smooth and pleasant and giving very little away. I found myself watching her hands. Carol had talked with her hands, expressive and unguarded. Megan's hands stayed still on the table the way the hands of someone stay still when they have taught themselves not to gesture because gesturing reveals things. An hour into the visit, she reached into her bag and produced a small sheaf of papers held together with a binder clip. "I hope you don't mind, Phone," she said, in the tone of someone who has been waiting to produce a thing and has decided the moment is right. "I set up a health insurance policy for you, as a gift. One of the plans Julian's company offers. I just need you to sign a couple of places." She set the papers on the table and put a pen beside them. Her index finger moved to the top of the stack, turning to the back page, pointing to 2 lines marked with small yellow sticky arrows of the kind you find in any office supply store. Beneficiary designation, signature required. I looked at the papers. I looked at the lines. I looked at her finger pointing to where she needed my name. A health insurance policy has no reason to require a beneficiary signature from the insured in that location on that form. I have processed enough paperwork in 20 years of business to know what insurance enrollment forms look like and what they ask for and where. What was in front of me was not a standard form. It was close enough that a man who didn't look carefully might not notice. I looked carefully. I picked up the pen. I signed both lines slowly and clearly the way I sign everything. The full signature, not the shorthand, I use for internal documents. Robert Allen Callahan, each letter formed the way my third-grade teacher, Miss Patterson, had drilled into us because she believed handwriting was a form of character and had made us practice it until we believed it too. Megan took the papers back and clipped them and put them in her bag without looking at what I had written. Her shoulders dropped approximately a quarter of an inch, the involuntary release of a person who has been holding tension they did not realize they were holding. "Thank you," she said. "I'll get this filed and you'll have your card in a few weeks." "I appreciate it," I said. We talked for another 30 minutes about nothing consequential. When she left, she hugged me at the door briefly, and with the careful pressure of someone who has decided in advance how long the hug will last. I stood in the doorway and watched her get into the silver SUV and back out of the driveway and drive away. Then I went inside and sat down at the kitchen table in front of 2 empty coffee cups and a plate with scone crumbs on it, and I thought about what had just happened with the particular clarity that comes when you have been watching for something long enough that seeing it does not surprise you, only confirms what you already knew. She had my signature now. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my phone. I opened the notes application and typed the date, the time, and a description of the forms, as specific as I could make it from memory. I described the yellow sticky arrows. I described the location of the signature lines. I described the binder clip. Then I called Ruth. "She came," I said when Ruth answered. And, "She got what she came for," I said. But so did I. The alert came on a Wednesday. I know the exact time because it is recorded in the email itself, timestamped by the Davidson County Register of Deeds system at 4:47 in the afternoon. And because I have looked at that timestamp enough times since then, that it has become one of those numbers that lives in the back of your mind the way certain dates do. The way you remember exactly what time the phone rang, when something important happened, even years later. I was at my desk in the Booth Property Care office working through route sheets for the following week when my phone buzzed on the desk beside me. I picked it up the way I pick up my phone 100 times a day, without particular attention, expecting a client inquiry or a supply delivery confirmation. The subject line stopped me. "Property fraud alert, Davidson County Register of Deeds. A new document has been recorded against your monitored property." I set the phone down on the desk. I picked it back up. I opened the email and read it slowly, the way you read something, when you already know what it is going to say and are reading it anyway, because the knowing and the seeing are 2 different things, and you need both before you can move. A quitclaim deed had been recorded against my property at Dunmore Street that afternoon. The document had been received at the county recorder's window at 2:15 and processed and entered into the official record by 4:30. The grantor named on the document was Robert Allen Callahan. The grantee was Megan Louise Crawford. According to the official property records of Davidson County, Tennessee, I had signed my house over to my daughter that afternoon. I had been in this office since 7:30 in the morning. I had not left except to walk to the coffee shop on the corner at 10 and return 12 minutes later with a large dark roast and a receipt that had the time printed on it. I had signed nothing today. I had appeared at no county office. I had met with no notary. Someone had taken my name and put it on a legal document and walked it across a government counter, and the government had stamped it and filed it without once picking up a phone to ask me if it was real. I put the phone face down on the desk and sat very still for a moment. My office manager, Sandra, was at the front desk 20 feet away, typing something. Through the window behind her, the parking lot was doing its ordinary Wednesday afternoon things. A delivery truck was backing into the loading area across the street, beeping steadily. The fluorescent light above my desk had been flickering for 3 days, and I had been meaning to replace the bulb and had not gotten around to it. Everything was exactly as it had been 30 seconds ago. That was the strangest part. The world looked completely unchanged by what had just happened in it. I thought about what Ruth had told me. The county recorder does not verify the signature. They process what is handed to them. The fraud alert does not stop the filing. It tells you the moment it lands. It had landed. I put on my jacket and told Sandra I had an errand and would be back before 5. I drove to the Davidson County Register of Deeds office on 2nd Avenue, found a parking spot on the street 2 blocks away, and walked in through the glass doors with 7 minutes to spare before closing. The clerk at the counter was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the practiced efficiency of someone who has processed 10,000 transactions and stopped being impressed by any of them. I told her I needed a certified copy of a document recorded against my property that afternoon. I gave her the parcel number. She typed, typed again, and then printed something and brought it to the counter and told me the fee was $3. I paid $3 and took the document to the row of plastic chairs along the wall and sat down and read it. It was 1 page. A standard Tennessee quitclaim deed formed the kind you can download from any legal document website, filled in with my property address and the transfer language and my name in the grantor line and Megan's name in the grantee line. At the bottom was a signature on the line marked grantor, and below it, a notary stamp and a notary signature certifying that Robert Allen Callahan had appeared in person before the notary on this date and signed this document of his own free will. I looked at the signature for a long time. Whoever had made it had studied mine carefully. The R was good. The A was close. The general shape and slant of the letters were a reasonable approximation of what my signature looks like to someone who has seen it a few times and practiced. What it did not have was the particular weight distribution I put on the second stroke of the L in Callahan, a habit I had developed in 3rd grade under Miss Patterson's instruction and had never lost. It did not have the slight leftward hook at the end of the final N that I have never been able to explain except that my hand does it and has always done it and is as much a part of my signature as the letters themselves. It was the forgery of someone who had my signature on a piece of paper and had copied the shape of it. It was not the forgery of someone who had watched me sign my name for 30 years. I took out my phone and photographed every line of the document, the property address, the transfer language, my forged name, the notary stamp with the notary's name and commission number and expiration date. I photographed the recording stamp in the corner with the document number and the date and time of recording. Then I folded the certified copy and put it in my jacket pocket, next to my chest, next to the folder with the fraud alert confirmation and the original deed. I walked back to my car in the early December dark, the temperature having dropped in the 2 hours since I left the office into something that felt honest about what month it was. My breath came out in visible puffs. The street was busy with people heading home from work, collars up, moving fast. I sat in my truck for several minutes without starting the engine. I thought about the yellow bucket in my first cargo van. I thought about the mason jar labeled the house. I thought about every sunrise I had gotten up for in 30 years, and every corner I had refused to cut, and every client who had handed me their key without a second thought because they knew I treated a home like something sacred. They had used a single piece of paper to try to take it. What I felt was not rage. I want to be precise about that because it matters. Rage is what happens when something surprises you. What I felt was something colder and more useful, a clarity so complete it was almost like calm, the feeling of a man who has been watching a storm build on the horizon for 2 months and has spent that time making sure every window in his house is properly latched. The trap I had been building, without quite naming it as a trap, had just sprung its first half. I started the truck. I drove back to the office and sat down at my desk and picked up the phone and called Ruth Calloway. "It happened," I said when she answered. There was a pause on the line, brief and professional. "When?" "This afternoon, 2:15 at the recorder's window. I have the certified copy." "All right," Ruth said, and her voice had the quality of a woman shifting into a gear she had used before and was not afraid of. "Come in tomorrow morning, and Robert, do not contact Megan or Julian tonight. Not a word." "I wasn't planning to," I said. I hung up and sat for a moment in my office with the flickering fluorescent light above me and Sandra's keyboard clicking at the front desk and the delivery truck long gone from across the street. Then I opened my desk drawer, took out the heavy-duty file folder with the masking tape label, and added the certified copy of the forged deed to everything else I had collected. The folder was getting thick. That was all right. I had been building things my whole life. I knew how to keep adding to something until it was finished. Ruth met me at her office at 8 the next morning, which meant she had come in an hour before her first scheduled appointment, which was the kind of thing Ruth did when she had decided a situation required her full attention before the ordinary business of the day got its hands on it. She had already pulled the recorded document from the county's online portal and printed it alongside my original deed. The 2 pages sat side by side on her desk when I came in, and looking at them together was clarifying in a way that looking at the forged deed alone had not quite been. The original had a quality of weight to it, the particular authority of a document that has been earned. The forgery had the same format, the same font, the same county stamp. What it did not have was any connection to reality. "I want to file a notice of fraudulent deed today," Ruth said before I had fully settled into the chair across from her. "A notice of fraudulent deed," she explained, "is a legal filing that flags the recorded document as disputed and places a notation in the property record alerting any title searcher or potential buyer that the deed's validity is being challenged in court. It does not immediately reverse the fraudulent transfer, but it puts the world on notice that the transfer is contested, which makes the property effectively unsellable and unfinanceable until the matter is resolved. This protects you on the title side," she said, "but you also need to go to the police." I had already decided that. I told her so. "Go this morning," she said. "Take everything. The original deed, the fraud alert confirmation, the certified copy of the forged deed, the screenshots of Julian's texts, your notes from every conversation. All of it." She looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. "And Robert. Tell them about the health insurance form, the signature they collected." I drove to the Metro Nashville Police Department's North Precinct after leaving Ruth's office and asked at the front desk to speak with a detective about a property crime. The officer at the desk made a call, and 12 minutes later, a man came through the interior door and introduced himself as Detective Gary Thomas. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, with a handshake that meant business and the kind of face that has absorbed a lot of information over the years without letting much of it show. He wore a sport coat that had seen better days and a tie that was doing its best. He led me to a small interview room with a table, 3 chairs, and a whiteboard on which someone had written a list of initials and partially erased it. I laid everything out on the table in the order it had happened. The purchase of the property, the newsletter notice, Megan's phone call, Julian's text about the deed, the visit to Ruth, the property fraud alert enrollment, Megan's visit with the insurance form, the alert on December 3rd, the certified copy of the forged deed with the notary stamp I had never appeared before. Thomas did not interrupt. He looked at each document as I placed it on the table and set it aside and looked at the next one, with the methodical attention of a man who knows that the order of things matters as much as the things themselves. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and crossed his arms and looked at the table for a moment. "Sir," he said, In 19 years, I have had maybe a handful of people walk in here with documentation this organized. I run a property management company, I said. I keep records. He almost smiled. Let me tell you what you're looking at from a criminal standpoint. In Tennessee, he explained forging a deed is a Class C felony under Tennessee Code. Annotated Section 3914-114, carrying a potential sentence of 3 to 15 years. Filing a false instrument with a government office is a separate Class E felony. The notary who certified the forged signature, if they knowingly participated, faces additional charges under the state's notary public statutes. This is not a civil dispute, Thomas said. What was done to your property is a serious crime. Then he told me about the guardianship petition. His department had run a search of Davidson County probate court filings after Ruth's office had flagged the property dispute that morning, and they had found something. The petitioner was listed as Megan Louise Crawford, next of kin. The petition included a medical assessment form completed by a physician I had never heard of, and had certainly never visited, diagnosing me with moderate to severe cognitive impairment, consistent with early-stage dementia. I sat with that for a moment. The fluorescent light in the interview room was steady, unlike the one in my office, and the steadiness of it felt almost aggressive in that moment, like something that refused to flicker when flickering would have been more appropriate. They want the house and the person, I said. That's what the paperwork suggests, Thomas said. What do I do about the guardianship petition? Get a competency evaluation, he said immediately. Independent from a board-certified neuropsychologist at an accredited facility. Have your attorney present and have it recorded. A documented evaluation from a credentialed examiner will outweigh an assessment from a physician no one can verify. He paused. Do it soon. The petition has a hearing date scheduled for January 8th. Oh, I wrote down January 8th on the notepad Thomas pushed across the table. Then I wrote down board-certified neuropsychologist and accredited facility and have it recorded. Thomas walked me out through the precinct lobby 40 minutes after I had arrived. At the door, he stopped and said, Mr. Callahan, the forged deed is solid evidence on its own. But a case like this gets considerably stronger if they attempt to act on it, if they try to take physical possession of the property. You mean if they show up? I said. I mean, if they show up believing the house is empty and the deed gives them the right to be there. He said it plainly, the way a man says something he has thought through and is not suggesting lightly. That's the difference between a crime on paper and a crime in front of witnesses. I shook his hand and walked to my truck in the cold December morning and sat behind the wheel for a moment, thinking about what he had said. Then I took out my phone and opened the notes application and found the name I had written there 2 weeks earlier after reading a series of articles in the Tennessean about property fraud targeting elderly homeowners in Middle Tennessee. Nancy Cole, staff reporter, Property and Consumer Affairs. I had written her desk number beneath her name. I dialed it now. She answered on the second ring with the clipped efficiency of someone who answers their desk phone the same way every time, regardless of what else is happening. Nancy Cole. My name is Robert Callahan, I said. I manage properties in Davidson County. I just came from a meeting with a detective about a forged deed on my home. I think you might want to hear this story. There was a pause, brief and interested. When can you come in? She said. The hardest thing about walking into a hospital to prove you are not losing your mind is that the building does not care why you are there. Vanderbilt University Medical Center receives several hundred patients a day. The parking garage is 8 stories tall and always full on the second level. The corridors smell like industrial cleaner and something underneath the cleaner that the cleaner is working hard to cover. The people moving through those corridors are carrying things, diagnoses, fears, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been waiting for news and none of them are thinking about the 62-year-old man in the good jacket, walking toward the neuropsychology department, with his attorney beside him and a video camera in his attorney's briefcase. Ruth had arranged the evaluation 2 days after my meeting with Thomas, calling in a professional contact at Vanderbilt's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. The examiner was a board-certified neuropsychologist named Dr. Patricia Ellison, which means she held both a doctoral degree and specialty certification from the American Board of Professional Neuropsychology, the standard required for her findings to carry legal weight in a Tennessee probate court proceeding. Ruth had explained all of this to me on the phone the night before precisely, and without rushing the way she explained everything that mattered. I had not slept well. Not from fear exactly. From something adjacent to fear, the particular restlessness of a man who knows tomorrow he will sit across from a stranger and answer questions designed to measure whether his mind still works, because his own daughter has filed a legal document claiming it does not. I want to say something about that because I think it deserves to be said plainly. My daughter told a court that I was not competent to manage my own affairs. She submitted paperwork with a physician's signature on it, a physician I had never met, certifying that I showed moderate to severe cognitive impairment. She did this while sitting in a house she shared with her husband, 40 minutes away, knowing it was not true, knowing it had never been true, knowing that if it worked, a judge would hand her legal control of my body and my finances and my home, and I would have no standing to object, because the court would have decided I lacked the capacity to object. That is what I was walking into Vanderbilt to fight. The evaluation took 4 hours and 20 minutes, across 2 sessions separated by a lunch break, during which Ruth and I sat in the hospital cafeteria, and she drank black coffee and I ate a turkey sandwich without tasting it. Dr. Ellison administered a battery of standardized assessments, the kind with names I had to write down afterward, to remember the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the repeatable battery for the assessment of neuropsychological status, the trail-making test, several others. She asked me to recall lists of words after delays. She asked me to draw a clock face showing 10 minutes after 11. She asked me about current events, about the sequence of my daily routines, about my business operations, and how I managed them. I answered every question. I did not rush, and I did not perform. I simply answered the way I have answered every question put to me in 62 years by anyone who asked one straight, which is to say directly and without decoration. At the end of the second session, Dr. Ellison set down her pen and looked at me across the table with the expression of a professional who has something to tell you and has decided to tell it to you rather than around you. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "your scores across every assessed domain fall within normal range for your age group. Several fall above it. There is no evidence of cognitive impairment of any kind, mild, moderate, or severe." She paused. "The assessment document submitted with the guardianship petition does not reflect any findings consistent with a legitimate clinical evaluation." Ruth, sitting in the corner with the video camera running, made a note. I thanked Dr. Ellison and shook her hand and walked out into the corridor with Ruth and stood there for a moment, while the hospital moved around us, all those people carrying their separate weights. "She called it," I said. "She documented it," Ruth said, which was the more important thing. 2 days later, Ruth called me with something else her office had found, while combing through the guardianship filing and its associated documents. A facility called Sycamore Ridge Care Center in Brentwood had a reservation on file for a resident named Robert Allen Callahan, effective December 26th. The reservation had been secured with a deposit. The deposit had been guaranteed against the property at Dunmore Street. Megan had booked a room for me at a care facility using my house as collateral before a judge had granted her any authority to do so, before I had been evaluated by any legitimate physician, and without my knowledge or consent. She had planned to move me out on December 26th. One day after Christmas, I sat at my kitchen table and read the document Ruth had emailed me, and then I set my phone down and put both hands flat on the table and looked at the grain of the wood for a long moment. The stool was against the wall in my peripheral vision, solid and unchanged. They were not just coming for the house. They had a date. They had a room. They had decided where I was going to spend the rest of my life, and they had put down a deposit on it, and the deposit was my home. I picked up my phone and called Thomas. "I'm ready," I said when he answered. He did not ask ready for what. He already knew. "Then let's talk about Christmas Eve," he said. Nancy Cole had been covering property fraud and consumer affairs for the Tennessean for 11 years, which meant she had spent 11 years listening to people tell her about the worst things that had happened to them in the context of a place they had called home. She had suggested a coffee shop on Charlotte Avenue, a narrow place with exposed brick walls and a chalkboard menu, and the particular background noise level of a room full of people having conversations they do not mind being overheard. Good for an interview, she had said on the phone. Enough ambient sound that nobody notices a recorder running. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a laptop open and a legal pad beside it, and a coffee that looked like it had been there long enough to cool to the temperature she preferred. She was in her mid-40s, compact and precise in the way of someone who has learned to take up exactly as much space as she needs, and not 1 inch more. She looked up when I came in and assessed me in approximately 1 second, in the way that reporters assess people quickly and without making you feel assessed. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "sit down. Tell me everything." I told her everything. I started with Carol dying the morning Megan was born, and did not stop until I got to Thomas saying, "Let's talk about Christmas Eve." It took an hour and 40 minutes. Nancy did not interrupt except to ask 3 questions, each one at the exact moment when the story might have moved on without leaving enough room for the detail she wanted. She wrote on the legal pad in handwriting so small I could not read it from across the table, and she typed occasional bursts into her laptop, and she kept her recorder running in the center of the table between us, a small black device she had placed there without asking my permission, and which I had not objected to because I had nothing to say that I was not willing to have recorded. When I finished, she sat back and was quiet for a moment, looking at her legal pad. Outside on Charlotte Avenue, a city bus went past, the particular diesel sound of it filling the coffee shop briefly and then fading. "The care facility," she said. "Sycamore Ridge." She put down a deposit. "Guaranteed against my property," I said, before any court had given her authority to act on my behalf. Nancy wrote something on the pad. "And the physician who signed the cognitive assessment. You have never been a patient of this physician." "I have never heard of this physician," I said. She wrote something else. Then she looked up at me with the expression of a person who has been doing a job long enough to know when a story is the kind that matters beyond the column inches it will fill. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "I have been writing about deed fraud and financial exploitation of older adults in this county for 3 years. I have interviewed 41 people who lost property this way or came close to losing it." She tapped her pen against the legal pad once. "Most of them came to me after the deed was filed, and they didn't know about it for 6 months. After the house was sold to a third party, and the legal untangling took 2 years. After they had already lost something they could not get back." She looked at me steadily. "You are the first person who has come to me before." "I had a fraud alert," I said. "You had a fraud alert," she agreed. "And you used it." She closed the laptop. "I want to be at the house on Christmas Eve." I had expected this. I had thought about how to answer it, and had decided before I walked into the coffee shop that the answer was yes with a condition. "You come as a witness," I said. "Not as law enforcement, not as a participant. You document what happens, and you report what you see. If it goes the way I think it will go, you will have everything you need for your story. If it doesn't go that way, you will have documented that too, and that documentation will matter. Nancy nodded once the nod of a person who understands the terms and finds them acceptable. I'll bring a camera, she said. Video and stills. Bring both, I said. She picked up her coffee, found it cold, and drank it anyway, with the unself-conscious practicality of a woman who has not let the temperature of a beverage slow her down in 11 years of deadline work. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead. The stool. The one you've moved with you every time. She had been listening carefully enough to remember it. Why did you keep it? I thought about how to answer that honestly. Outside, the bus was long gone and Charlotte Avenue had returned to its ordinary December self, cold and gray, and going about its business. Because throwing it away would have meant deciding she wasn't coming back, I said, and I wasn't ready to decide that. Nancy wrote that down. She wrote it down slowly and deliberately, the way she wrote things she intended to use. We shook hands at the door of the coffee shop, and she walked to her car, and I walked to my truck, and I sat behind the wheel for a moment in the December cold, thinking about what I had just done. I had invited a reporter to witness what might be the worst night of my life, or the best one depending entirely on whether 30 years of careful preparation and one yellow bucket and one fraud alert and the unshakable belief that a man's home is the one thing nobody gets to take from him would turn out to be enough. I started the truck. I drove home. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the stool against the wall for a long time. Then I called Thomas and told him Nancy Cole was in. Thomas and I met for the last time at a diner on Gallatin Avenue on the morning of December 15th. A place with vinyl booths and coffee that came in a pot left on the table, and hash browns that arrived faster than seemed possible, given that the kitchen appeared to be staffed by one person. He had a legal pad. I had my file folder. We ordered eggs and went to work. Walk me through their logic, I said. Thomas poured his coffee and set the pot down and thought for a moment the way he thought about things without rushing it. She has a deed. But a deed is only as good as what you can do with it. To sell the property or refinance against it quickly, she needs to demonstrate actual possession. She needs to be inside the house with changed locks and the deed in hand before you know what's happening. At that point, she's the one who looks like the rightful owner to any title company or lender who doesn't dig too deep. And the fastest way to establish possession, I said, is to come when the house looks empty. When they believe you are somewhere else, he said. Somewhere far enough away that you can't get back in time to stop them. He drank his coffee. They will want to do it on a night when your absence is plausible, when it would make sense to a stranger that you aren't home. We both already knew which night that was. I had no Christmas tradition that anyone in my family could point to. No gathering I attended. No standing invitation, no table I was expected at. For 35 years, the story my family had told to themselves and to anyone who asked was that Robert spent Christmas alone. That Robert had no one. The story was not entirely untrue, which made it more useful to them than a lie would have been. They would assume the house on Dunmore Street was dark on Christmas Eve. They would assume its owner was sitting somewhere small and quiet, the way people with nowhere to go sit on holidays. They had spent 3 decades building that assumption, and they were about to stake everything on it. They'll bring someone for the locks, Thomas said. A locksmith. Change the deadbolts, establish physical control, make it look like a routine job if a neighbor comes by. Julian shows the deed if anyone asks. By morning, they're the owners of record, in fact, and on paper both. I thought about the locksmith. I thought about a man hired to do a job he was told was legitimate, carrying his tools up my porch steps on Christmas Eve with no way of knowing the full shape of what he had been pulled into. "The locksmith won't be charged," I said. "Not if he cooperates," Thomas agreed. "And he will cooperate. They always do when they understand the situation." We finished breakfast and split the check and stood outside in the December cold going over the positioning. Thomas and 2 plainclothes officers would enter through the back door after dark on Christmas Eve, using the key I would leave under the 3rd porch step, a location known only to Thomas and Ruth. Nancy Cole would position herself in the turret room on the 3rd floor with a clear sight line to the front hall. Ruth would be on call, available by phone from the moment they arrived. I would park 3 streets over on Fern Valley Road and walk back to the house in the dark and enter through the kitchen door with my own key. I would sit in the armchair in the front parlor with my file folder on my lap and wait. "Keep every light off," Thomas said. "The house needs to look exactly like what they expect it to look like." "Empty," I said. "Empty," he said. That afternoon, I called Megan. I had been thinking about what to say since the meeting with Thomas, turning the words over, finding the exact combination that would land the way I needed it to land, without tipping anything that couldn't be untipped. She answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice carried the careful warmth she had been deploying since October, the warmth that sounded almost real if you hadn't spent 62 years learning the difference between warmth and the performance of it. "Daddy," she said, "how are you feeling?" "Good," I said. "Listen, I wanted to let you know I'm going to be away for Christmas. Old friend from my lumberyard days lives up in Cookville now, invited me up for the week. I figured it was time to get out of the house for a few days." The pause that followed lasted 3 seconds. I counted them the same way I had counted the seconds of silence before she said my name the first time she called, because silences in a conversation tell you as much as the words do if you are paying attention. "That sounds nice," she said. Her voice had shifted almost imperceptibly, the particular relaxation of someone who has just received information they were hoping to receive. "When are you leaving?" "Morning of the 24th, I said. "Early." "Well," another small pause. "Have a wonderful time, Daddy. You deserve a break." After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen of my townhouse with the phone in my hand and looked at the stool against the wall and thought about my daughter's voice saying, "You deserve a break," with the specific warmth of someone who has just been told the location of something they plan to take while you are not looking. She had no idea I was not going to Cookville. She had no idea I was going to walk back to Dunmore Street in the dark on Christmas Eve and sit in my own front parlor with 62 years of receipts in my lap, and every light off, and 3 police officers in the next room, and a reporter in the tower, and 2 pieces of paper in a file folder that between them told the whole story of what that house was and who it belonged to. I packed a bag that evening, a real one, and put it in my truck so it would be visible if anyone happened to check. Then I drove to Dunmore Street and walked through every room of the house in the dark, touching the walls the way I had the first night, learning the rooms again by feel. I locked the front door behind me when I left. The deadbolt caught with the same solid sound it always made. I stood on the porch in the December cold and looked out at Cedarwood Heights, going about its quiet evening business lights in the windows up and down the street, the smell of wood smoke from someone's fireplace drifting down the block. 4 days, I thought. 4 more days. Before I reveal the ultimate confrontation and exposure on Christmas Eve, please comment, "Still here," so I know you're still following this journey with me. Also, please note, the upcoming parts include some fictionalized elements structured for educational and viewing purposes. If this content doesn't suit your preferences, you may exit the video right here. I had been sitting in the dark for 2 hours and 40 minutes when I heard the first car. Not the sound of a car passing on the street, which I had been hearing all evening, The ordinary traffic of a neighborhood settling into Christmas Eve, families arriving at houses up and down Dunmore Street, with headlights that swept briefly across my front windows and moved on. This was different. This was a car that turned into my driveway and slowed. The tires on the gravel of my driveway made a particular sound, a low, careful crunching, the sound of someone trying not to make noise while driving on a surface that makes noise regardless of how carefully you drive. I had poured that gravel myself in October, 3 tons of pea gravel from a landscaping supplier on Nolansville Road, raked it level on a Saturday morning with the particular satisfaction of a man improving something that belongs to him. I knew exactly what it sounded like under a tire moving at normal speed, and I knew what it sounded like under a tire moving slowly and carefully in the dark. This was the second kind. I sat very still in the armchair in the front parlor. The room was completely dark, every lamp off, every curtain drawn the way Thomas had instructed. The file folder was on my lap, both hands resting on top of it. 30 feet above me in the turret room, I knew Nancy Cole was positioned at the window with her camera, and through the wall to my right, I knew Thomas and his 2 officers were standing in the dining room. In the dark, not moving, not speaking, waiting with the practiced stillness of people who have done this before, and understand that patience in these moments is not passive. It is the work. The car stopped. The engine cut off. Then a second car turned into the driveway. The gravel announced it the same way it had announced the first, that slow, careful crunching that was trying to be quieter than gravel allows. It stopped behind the first. Doors opened. I counted them by sound. 1, 2 from the first car. 1, 2, 3 from the second. 5 people. I had expected 4, Megan and Julian and my parents. The 5th was the locksmith, and the sound of him was different from the others, a heavier step, the particular purposeful movement of someone arriving to do a job rather than to witness one. Voices reached me through the front wall low and clipped the voices of people managing themselves in the cold. Julian's voice first carrying the bright edge of a man who has been building towards something for months and can feel the end of it. Then Megan quieter and sharper. Keep your voice down. A pause. Everyone stays together until the locks are changed. Then a voice I did not recognize, flat and professional. The locksmith. Which door you want me to start with? Front, Julian said. Then we'll do the back and the side entry off the kitchen. Footsteps on the porch steps. 4 sets, then a 5th, heavier one. The porch boards absorbed them differently than the gravel, had a sequence of creaks that moved from the steps to the landing to the front door. And I tracked each one the way you track something you have been listening for so long that your body has tuned itself to the frequency of it. Then something I had not expected. My mother's voice. Soft and uncertain, the voice of a woman who had spent her life being certain about things and was discovering too late and on the wrong porch that certainty is not the same as being right. Are we sure about this, Julian? Julian did not hesitate. We have the paperwork, Margaret. It's done. We're just coming to collect what's already ours. Margaret. He called her Margaret when he wanted her to feel like an adult being addressed by another adult rather than a mother-in-law being managed by a son-in-law. I had noticed that at the one wedding I attended, some people use your full name as a form of affection. Some use it as a form of control. Julian had always been the second kind. My father said nothing. I had not heard his voice since I walked into this house tonight, and I did not hear it now. He was there, I knew, because Megan had mentioned he would be, but whatever he was feeling on my front porch on Christmas Eve, he was keeping inside himself the way he had kept most things inside himself for 60 years. The locksmith set his bag down on the porch. I heard the dull clunk of it, the metal tools settling against each other inside. Then the sound I had been waiting for and dreading and preparing for in equal measure. Metal on metal, the pick entering the lock cylinder. It was a small sound, precise and purposeful and cold. I had replaced the deadbolt myself 3 weeks ago, a Schlager B6 ON, the kind rated for residential security and sold at every hardware store in America, the kind that an experienced locksmith can open in under 3 minutes with the right tools and enough practice. I had known that when I bought it. I had bought it anyway because the lock was never the point. The lock, it was just the last thing between outside and inside, and what mattered was not whether it held, but what was waiting on the other side of it when it didn't. Above me, I heard nothing from the turret room. Nancy was good at her job. Beside me through the wall, I heard nothing from the dining room. Thomas was better at his. I sat in the dark armchair with the folder on my lap and my hands flat on top of it, and I breathed slowly and listened to a locksmith work on my front door on Christmas Eve, while the gravel in my driveway held the weight of 5 people who had driven here to take my home. And I thought about the yellow bucket and the mason jar and the 30 years of mornings I had gotten out of bed and gone to work because the work was the only answer I had ever found to the question of what a man does when the people who should have been on his side decided not to be. The pick turned, the deadbolt slid, my front door swung open into the dark. Megan came first. Her flashlight beam entered the house before she did, swinging across the front hall, in a wide arc, catching the staircase banister, the high ceiling, the heart pine floors. I had spent 2 weekends refinishing in October. The beam moved the way the beam of someone who has been thinking about a room moves not randomly, but with the specific attention of a person who has been imagining this space and is now checking the imagination against the reality. She stepped across the threshold, and the porch boards released her weight, and the hall floor accepted it, and my daughter was inside my house for the first time, without my permission or my knowledge, or so she believed. Julian came in right behind her. He did not use a flashlight. He used his phone, the screen brightness, turned all the way up, held out in front of him like a torch. And the first thing he did when he cleared the door frame was stop and look up. The ceiling in my front hall is 11 feet original plaster with a medallion at the center, where a chandelier had once hung, the plaster work intact and detailed in a way that you do not find in houses built after the Second World War. I had looked at that ceiling the first day I walked through this house and felt something shift in my chest. Julian looked at it now with the expression of a man calculating square footage. "Would you look at this place?" he said. His voice filled the hall the way voices fill empty spaces, finding the walls and the ceiling, and coming back changed. He was not whispering anymore. The second he was across the threshold, the pretense of caution dropped away from him like a coat he had been wearing only because the weather required it. All of this, for her, or Megan was already moving deeper into the house, the flashlight finding the parlor doorway, the entrance to the dining room, the foot of the staircase. She had a clipboard under her arm, an actual clipboard with papers on it. She had come with a list. "We change every lock tonight," she said, her voice low and businesslike. "Front, back, side entry. Julian, call Hendricks when we're done and tell him we're confirmed for the title company appointment on the 27th. Julian pulled out the deed. He had been carrying it folded in the inside pocket of his jacket, and he took it out and unfolded it and held it up in the beam of his phone light and looked at it with the satisfaction of a man who has been waiting a long time to hold a thing and is now holding it. "By tomorrow morning," he said, "we are the owners of record and in possession. Any title company, any lender, any attorney who looks at this sees a clean transfer and a family in residence." He refolded the deed and tapped it against his palm. "She can't touch it." The locksmith had stopped in the doorway. He was a heavy-set man in a gray work jacket, with his company name on the breast pocket, and he stood at the threshold, with his bag in his hand, and the particular stillness of a person who has entered a room and found the atmosphere different from what he was told to expect. He was looking at the clipboard under Megan's arm. He was looking at the deed in Julian's hand. He was putting things together in the way that a man who has worked in other people's houses long enough puts things together when something does not add up. He did not say anything yet, but he was going to. The locksmith's unease was the only honest thing in the room. Margaret and my father came in last, slower than the others, my father's hand finding the doorframe briefly for balance before he let go. Margaret moved to the center of the hall and turned in a slow circle, her flashlight beam moving across the walls, the staircase, the ceiling. She was wearing her good coat, the charcoal wool one she saved for occasions, which told me she had dressed for this the way you dress for something you have been anticipating. "It's so much bigger than I expected," she said softly. My father stood just inside the door. He had not moved further into the house. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the hall and did not say anything and did not move, and I watched him from the dark doorway of the parlor and understood that he had come tonight because not coming would have required a kind of resistance he had never once in his life managed to find. Then Julian turned in a slow circle in the center of my front hall, the deed in one hand and his phone light in the other, and he laughed. It was the laugh of a man who has wanted something for a long time and is standing in the middle of it and wants everyone present to understand that he has won. "She never belonged in a place like this," he said. He said it to the ceiling, to the walls, to the 11 feet of original plaster above him. He was talking about me. He was standing in the center of my home on Christmas Eve, holding a forged document with my name on it, and he was talking about me. I had been waiting for a sign. I had told myself I would know the moment when I felt it. I had imagined various versions of this moment over the past 3 weeks, various words or actions that would tell me the crime was complete, that everything was in place, that there was nothing left to wait for. I had not imagined it would be those words. But it was those words. Every element was present. They were inside the house. Julian held the forged deed openly in his hand. The locksmith's tools were on the floor. Megan's clipboard with her list of things to do to my home was under her arm. Margaret and my father were across the threshold. The crime was complete. The trap was full. I reached over to the lamp on the table beside my armchair. I turned it on. 40 watts. In a room dark for 3 hours, it was enough. Nobody moved. Julian's phone was still raised. Megan's flashlight was still on. The locksmith stood with one hand on his bag strap. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest. My father stayed where he had been since he walked in, just inside the door, going nowhere. Then their eyes adjusted, and they saw what I had filled the dark with. Thomas stepped out of the dining room with his badge open at chest height, calm and unhurried. 2 plainclothes officers took up positions on either side of the hall. From the turret stairwell came the sound of Nancy's camera shutter, steady and clear. Julian's mouth opened. The forged deed was still in his right hand, exactly where Thomas needed it. "What is this?" Julian said. Then louder, the panic cracking through. "What did you do? What is this?" "Mr. Crawford." Thomas's voice carried no drama whatsoever. "Hold that document still. Do not fold it." Julian looked at the badge. He looked at the officers. Something left his face in layers, the confidence, the entitlement, all of it going at once. And what was underneath was just a man holding a piece of paper that had become the worst thing he had ever touched. "This is our house," he said, his voice climbing out of its register. "The transfer is legal. We have documentation." "You are inside a residence without the owner's permission," Thomas said, holding a document bearing a forged signature filed to fraudulently transfer real property. In Tennessee, that is a Class C felony. Filing a false instrument is a Class E felony. You have committed both tonight with the evidence in your hand. Julian looked at Megan. She was staring at the floor, arms crossed over her clipboard flashlight, hanging dead at her side. "Julian," she said quietly, "put it down." He put it down. Thomas produced handcuffs. Miranda rights followed each phrase, landing with the weight a man earns from saying them 10,000 times and meaning them every time. Margaret made a sound, not words. Her hand found my father's arm. He took it without looking up. I walked to the center of my hall and looked at my daughter. "Megan," I said, "come sit down." I pointed to the stool. Megan sat down on the stool without being told twice. Julian's voice was still coming through the front wall in pieces, high and ragged, the voice of a man who had bet everything on a single hand and was watching the cards get turned face up one by one. Then a car door closed, and the night took him, and the hall went quiet. Thomas moved to the far wall with his notebook. Nancy came down from the turret stairwell, read the room in 1 second, and sat on the bottom step with her camera at her side. I pulled a chair from against the wall and sat across from my daughter. 6 feet between us. She looked up at me with dry eyes which told me more than tears would have. "How long?" she asked. "From the first call," I said. "October." Her jaw tightened. "The insurance form. You already knew when you signed it." "I needed the crime to be real before the law could touch it," I said. "Ruth explained that to me." She looked down at the stool beneath her. She ran one hand along the edge of the seat slowly, the way you touch something you recognize from a long time ago. "I know what this is," she said. "You should," I said. "I made it for you when you were 3. Her breath caught. Outside, the wind moved hard against the eaves, and the old house groaned once and settled. "That first Christmas," I said. "Why did you send me back to my truck?" She told me. All of it. The lie she had told Julian's family before I showed up. The panic when she saw me on the porch with my cookies and my carved frame and my work jacket. The way the lie had grown roots she couldn't pull without pulling everything built on top of them. When she finished, she was crying. Not the careful kind. The kind that has been waiting 20 years for a room quiet enough to happen in. I stood up. I did not go to her. Some distances close in their own time, or they do not close at all. I walked to Thomas. "She'll cooperate," I said. "I'll need her statement tonight." "She'll give it." I walked back to the center of my front hall and put my hand flat against the wall the way I had the first night I ever stood in this house. Still solid, still holding. The last patrol car turned off Dunmore Street at 11:47 and took its lights with it. Thomas shook my hand at the door. Nancy nodded once on her way out, the same nod she had given me in the coffee shop, the one that meant I saw it, and I will tell it true. Ruth called to confirm the notice of fraudulent deed was filed, and that she would move to void the forged transfer Thursday morning. I locked the front door. The deadbolt caught clean. Then I went to the kitchen and reached under the sink and took out the yellow bucket. $4.69. 30 years ago, the morning after Megan left. This was the third one. Same color, same shape, same handle that sat at a slight angle when you set it down. I carried it to the front parlor and placed it in the center of the room. The file folder on the side table, the stool in the corner, the bucket on the floor. 3 things that between them held the whole shape of what I had built and why. I sat in the armchair and looked at them for a long time without needing to name what I felt. Here is what happened after. The $90,000 that started all of this was still $90,000 when the gavel came down, now stacked on top of a criminal record. Megan cooperated fully and received supervised probation. She lost her job when Nancy's story ran on the front page of the Tennessean on January 3rd. 4 readers enrolled in their county fraud alert program after reading it. I kept their letters. Ruth got the forged deed voided by court order on January 14th. In February, a Tuesday, I found an envelope in my mailbox. No return address, inside one sheet of paper folded once. A pencil drawing of the oak stool. No words. Just the lines careful and exact, the proportions right, the way only someone who had sat on it as a child would know to draw them. I took it inside and set it on the kitchen table next to my coffee. Outside, the oak tree was bare. But if you looked at the ends of the branches, there were buds, small and closed and patient. I drank my coffee while it was warm. Sitting alone in this house, I realized that building a fortress out of meticulous records can safeguard your brick and mortar, but it cannot fix a broken home. I thought I was delivering justice, but real peace doesn't come from a calculated trap. If there is one thing I know now, it is that God does not build a man's life out of bitterness, and neither should you. Don't be like me. Don't spend decades preparing for the worst from the people you love just to prove you can survive it. In the end, my obsession with protecting what was mine left me standing entirely alone in an empty hall. These intense family stories, revenge projects, might protect your physical assets, but they ultimately bankrupt the soul. I thought this bitter family drama revenge saga would bring closure, but an eye for an eye only leaves the whole world blind. If you find yourself trapped in your own family drama revenge cycle, choose a different path. Do not let your own dark family stories, revenge, memories dictate your future. Walk away before the cold family drama revenge mindset consumes everything true inside you. This tragic family story's revenge ending is a lesson bought at too high a price. What would you have done in my shoes? Comment your thoughts below, share this video, and subscribe to Revenge Dad for more gripping, profound storytelling. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end.